context of her life, the 16th century, I personally think this is important. It's easy enough to see St Teresa and her teaching on prayer, but if we understand the person and the issues that she faced, I think we see a greater depth in many things indeed. The church in Teresa's time in Spain in the 16th century was facing a number of crises. And this is what I'm going to present now, is the self-understanding of the hierarchy. Okay? So they thought they had a pretty major problem in people of Jewish descent. Now, I spoke about that on Friday night. They thought that these people were particularly prone to heresy, that they were only pretending to be Catholics while secretly maintaining their Jewish faith. That was their suspicious mindset. There was another broad group of people who they were worried about, and these were women. And in particular, the groups of women who began in the southern part of Spain in the late 15th century, then into the 16th century, called the Alumbrados, the Illuminated. These were small prayer groups of women who were intent on a union with God through a mystical type of prayer. And you might think that this was something that the church would say was bless and encourage, but the women went another step further and said, if I am in this union with God, what need have I of the clergy to mediate this union? I don't need them. They're excess to requirements. And not only did they say that, but they also said, well, what need have I of material things like the sacraments of the church and so on? So these were considered to be heretics and condemned at various times, 1525 and so on, 1511 there was another. And so there was a suspicion among the clergy, the hierarchy, that women were a little bit irrational, emotional, and prone to mystical ideas that would put them out of a job, the clergy out of a job. So, you didn't want women praying in a contemplative way because it was outside your control. That's the other thing. It's all right if they were saying rosaries, because you could listen to them and hear what they were saying, but if you couldn't hear what they were thinking, there was a big question mark in the hierarchy's mind. So there was a suspicion about interior prayer. The third major category of people to worry about, as far as the hierarchy was concerned, was that after 1517 and Luther began the Protestant Reformation, the idea that people had ideas that were influenced by Luther and his rejection of the communion with the centre of the Church in Rome. So people who had studied in Leuven and Louvain and places like this, and who came back to Spain with some questions and ideas, who thought it was a good idea to have home masses and didn't see why the priest should wear vestments and so on, were categorised as being Lutherans. In fact, the hierarchy really couldn't tell the difference between Lutherans, mystics, and conversos. All three were in the gun. St Teresa, of course, somebody of converso background, was somebody who propagated and said that she had religious experiences of God, and the response from her confessors and friends at the time was, these are from the devil. This is far too dangerous for anybody like you to have. You must be deluded, and the safest thing and the best thing we can do for you is to tell you it's from the devil, and then you can dismiss these aberrations and never encourage them again. Can you see where they're coming from? And that's the background. That's why they were giving that advice to Teresa in the mid-1550s. Thank God for the Jesuits. Because shortly after this experience, the Jesuits came to the city of Avila and opened a school there. And in that school, there was a young community, and one of the priests there, a young, newly ordained priest, Teresa went to and made her confession to him. And the thing about the Jesuits was, religious experience didn't frighten them. They had done the spiritual exercises of St Ignatius over a month, and they were at home with this and did not panic as her other friends and confessors and spiritual advisors had, and were willing then to discern with her the authenticity of the words that Jesus gave her and the meaning of what her experience was. Thank God for the Jesuits. So Teresa, having had these spiritual experiences, having grown in the spiritual life in her early 40s, at this time, part of the fruitfulness of her experience was that she began to listen to the aspirations of young women. Their spiritual aspirations. What did they want out of life? What did they want to have in terms of their being spiritual Catholics, and what sort of things could Teresa do to help them and to encourage them, to guide them? As a result of this, she became their spiritual mother. She heard what was in their hearts, and she shared what was in her heart, and she guided them. What I would say now, looking back on this, is you can see the authenticity of Teresa's religious experience by its fruitfulness in her life and the effects of her experience in her being able to bring to life and to guide securely the young women who were coming to her for spiritual direction. These young women then had this idea of forming a new community. One of the things I just might say as well is Teresa also didn't just listen to the aspirations of young women. She went to confession frequently, more frequently than anyone in this room has ever gone to confession, because she had this question mark over her. So she would go not just to the parish priest, heaven's sakes, not at all. She had to go to theologians, dry as dust, Dominicans, Jesuits who had a sense of spiritual experience, who understood what she was talking about. But one of the curious things that happened, in hearing her confessions, they were converted often. Because what they saw that she had, and they saw and intuited the authenticity of her life and of her experience of Jesus Christ, they wanted that. And the famous example is the Pedro Ibanez, a great Dominican theologian, who after hearing Teresa's confession for some time was converted and decided he would leave his chair in the university, go to a remote monastery in the country and live a life of prayer and penance himself. Not often that this happens, but what I'm saying is Teresa has at her heart of her way of ministering to others is her relationships. And in her relationships, she brings people to a spiritual health and opens up for them desires to go beyond where they are and to have something that she had. So that's the first point I want to make this morning. The young girls that she was dealing with came up with this idea themselves of starting a new community, not like the community that Teresa was living in, where there were up to 160 nuns. It was, as I think I said on Friday night, one of the dangers of the time was inflation and dowry inflation, which meant you couldn't marry off your daughters and keep their honour, so you put them in the convent, either as nuns or as lay boarders, and they brought their servants with them. They lived in apartments, they had cooks and so on. But they went to their prayers and so on, and it was a way of life. They didn't want this. They wanted a smaller type of community, a more intentional style of community, a simpler lifestyle, where there was some austerity of life as well. They wanted simpler liturgies. The trouble with the liturgies of the time was that they went on and on, something that we don't have nowadays, clearly. And so instead of singing and polyphony and so on, a very simple monotone for the Psalms, Teresa wanted to cut out excessive devotions. She wanted to cut out the extra prayers for benefactors. In her convent, one of the things, a will was made by a man who donated money to the community with the intention that I think it was his wife, was to be buried there, or himself, and a nun was to kneel beside the grave, holding a lighted candle and praying for his eternal salvation, for his wife's eternal salvation. I've forgotten which one it is. If you do that all the time, it builds up. And one of the other things Teresa wanted to do was to break the nexus, the connection between the aristocracy and religious life. Because the communities were founded by the wealthy families of Avila, as in other towns, and you'd have the coat of arms of the order there, and you'd have the coat of arms of the family who provided the money to keep the place, build it and keep it going. Teresa said, no, we don't want to live in palace monasteries. The same scale the monasteries are often in the ancient cities of Spain. As you walk around, it's very hard from the outside to tell the difference between a palace and a monastery. The architecture is identical, the scale is identical. Remarkable. She wanted something smaller in scale. She wanted something similar. She wanted simpler. She wanted to cut off the ties to the aristocracy. They were no longer to be kept women praying for the salvation of the members of the aristocratic families. That's why the foundations were made. People were in fear of their eternal salvation, so they would found a monastery, the purpose of which was to pray for the salvation of the members of the donating family. It's another world, different to ours. And they also wanted an enclosure that was a real separation from the distractions and gossip of the town, so that they could live a life with silence and solitude, focused on Christ, a life of recollection that Bishop David spoke about yesterday, where the memory of Christ was kept alive in the minds and hearts of the sisters, where there was a mutual presence between Christ and the individual nun, where that sense of being with the Lord was throughout the entire day. And where, because they simplified the liturgy, there was more space in the timetable, they gave then 2 free hours a day for interior prayer, where people were trusted to enter into a personal relationship with Christ, and where they would discern the meaning of that prayer through conversations with their prioress. Teresa was empowering women as spiritual directors, certainly allowing the sisters to go to different confessors, but also wanting not to put the same emphasis on the priest as the only one who could give spiritual direction. This sounds an extremely intense religious life. Teresa balanced 2 hours of prayer a day with 2 hours of recreation a day. There is a balance and a humanity in this. And as I said the other day, one of the things that I think sums up this type of community, these sisters are called to live together and to live a life which is one of becoming true friends of Christ, of entering into that relationship with Him which comes to a union which is analogous to marriage, but also within a community where all were equal. She didn't want to have the style of social divisions within a community that had characterized the community of the Incarnation, where she became a nun. So if you were an aristocrat, as you joined the community, the honour of this world stopped at the front door. Your titles, your pretensions, and everything that gave you prestige in the world stopped at the front door. So when you entered, they would open the door, welcome you, they would kiss you, and very soon afterwards, St Teresa would give you a broom. Manual work for everyone. There were no servants of the community, but everyone was a servant to one another. All their aristocratic titles went out the window. Teresa, when she left the Convent of the Incarnation in January thereabouts, 1563, walked up the big hill to the walls of Avila, to the Basilica of San Vicente, went down there and prayed before the Lord, before Our Lady of the Underground, and took off her shoes and walked barefoot in the freezing cold to San Jose, the first community. And when she arrived there, she had a new name. No longer the title of honour in the world, Doña Lady Teresa de Cepeda y Armada, but Madre Teresa de Jesus. If you want to understand me, who I am, look to Jesus, not to fake aristocracy. So, the sisters who joined, whether they were from aristocratic families or peasant families, were all on the one level. Not lowest common denominator, pushing everybody down, but they were given, like Teresa, a new name. And they became aristocrats, not of this world with its power and wealth and prestige, its violence and domination, but of the kingdom of God with its justice and peace, its freedom and holiness, its joy. And so the sisters would be Sister Isabella of the Cross, de la Cruz, one way of saying it, de Jesus, de la Santa Virgen, etc., etc. Reversing the honours of this world so that they could all live in a community of equals where all were friends. Here, all must be friends, all must be loved, all must be held dear, all must be helped. That's chapter 4, number 7 of the Way of Perfection. That was the style of the community. Not a large palace, small house that had been converted with a bit of a backyard in which the sisters could build a couple of hermitages so that they could have retreat days as well. A poor community, dependent on alms and the goodwill of their neighbours, rather than being dependent on relationship with the aristocracy. Teresa says that she wanted small communities because, well, once you get a big place, you think of honour and all that goes with it, and you become obsessed with money and things like that which you need to keep it all going. And she says, well, I don't want anything like that. What is most important is that it be small. Now, she says, it would not be right for the house of 13 poor little women to make a loud crash when it falls. The truly poor must make no noise. They must be noiseless people so that others will take pity on them. They shouldn't be proud. They shouldn't cause distress to everyone else by the noise that happens on the last day. Houses small and poor, not large. We haven't been really good on following that, I must admit, but there you go. But it is important for Teresa, and it's important for the community to be a sign that luxury and wealth are not the way of the gospel, that we in fact identify not with our social superiors and envy what they have and want the appliances and the sort of buildings they have, but identify with our poorer brothers and sisters and live in ways that are similar to them. These ideas of poverty do not come from the Carmelite tradition. They come from the Franciscans and the help that Teresa received from spiritual Franciscans called the Discalced Franciscans of her day, and in particular Peter of Alcantara, since a saint, a great man really, highly intelligent, but very austere. The Discalced movement was a movement of renewal of religious life, which focused on Christ and the following of Christ, in simplicity and austerity, focusing on poverty and prayer, of great humility in the way of life. Teresa learnt much from them, and her taking off her shoes meant that she was discalced, barefoot, and her sisters and her order then became known as the Discalced Carmelites. Teresa lived the time of the Reformation when the church was facing that of the panic, moral panic and anxiety about the Reformation, the panic about what the people who were Jewish converts might be up to. For her, it all meant that the world was in flames. The world is all in flames. They want to sentence Christ again, so to speak, since they ravage his church. What she's talking about is the news that she had received from France of the wars of religion there, where Protestants were burning churches, smashing tabernacles, smashing altars, killing priests, and so on. She thinks they're Lutherans. They weren't Lutherans, but she thought they were. And it is this empathy with the church and its loss of unity that impels her in the crisis of the church of her day to do something. But since women can't do anything in public, what she will do is to have another strategy, which is to have a community where the friends of one another were dear friends of Christ, good Christians, and they would pray at the heart of the church for the reformation of the church, for the renewal of the church and its leaders, so that the church may be reunited once more. It's about Christian unity that is the thing that drives Teresa personally. She has listened to the needs of the young women who want a time of prayer and an personal relationship with Christ, but she's also aware of what's happening outside, and she wants to be part of the church's efforts to recover its unity after the break of the Reformation. The thing is, though, that Teresa is remarkably critical, as she tells us in chapter 3 of this book, The Way of Perfection, about the way people in the church, the hierarchy, are trying to solve the problems. Teresa, when she died, kept saying, "I die a daughter of the Church." This has been interpreted by people ever since as that Teresa was somebody who never had the slightest question about the way the Church does things, was always completely obedient in all things. But, as it turns out, if you read this illuminating chapter 3 in the Way of Perfection, she was very critical. She says, people have tried to see if with the force of arms they could remedy all the evil that is making such progress. It seems to me that what is necessary is a different approach. She's not in favour of the Inquisition. She's not in favour of using violence to create peace and reconciliation in the Church. Peace never comes through violence. And violence in the Church is always Antichrist. So she's praying for priests, preachers and theologians, and for bishops and religious, that God may advance them very far in the perfection of the religious life and their vocation, in their relationship with Christ, that they may have that same sense of being loved by Christ that she had. That they may have that same security from that they may have a dynamism that will enable them to proceed non-violently, mercifully, generously, pastorally, to fulfill their duties in the care of the flock. For, she tells us, it is the ecclesiastical, not the secular arm that will save us. Secular arm is, you find somebody guilty of heresy, you hand them over to the state, to the secular arm, and they execute them. Burn them at the stake. This is an appalling climate that Teresa lived in. 1559, in the city of Valladolid, there was a priest who came back from Louvain, who had picked up some Lutheran ideas there, who was a chaplain to a convent of Poor Clare nuns, where they were experimenting with simpler styles of liturgy and religious life, and as a consequence of this were condemned for being Lutherans, and were marched through the streets of the city to the great square and burnt at the stake in front of the king and the royal court, the bishops and the religious, and the entire population of the city cheering this on, for saying that we are saved by grace alone. Ever since Cardinal Cassidy signed on behalf of the Roman Catholic Church the Roman Catholic Lutheran statement agreed statement on justification by faith alone, seems to me the only people in that square who were not heretics were those who were being burnt at the stake. Isn't this sad? That's the climate. Teresa does not agree with this. I think the spiritual means that she envisages are the ones that she used, that is, listening to people, hearing what is in their heart and mind, and then engaging them in conversation. It's what she did in many, many different situations. She would listen to an angry young priest who had just come back from the University of Salamanca to sing his first Mass for his family in Medina del Campo, and she asked that she could see him. And he says, "These Carmelites, they're idiots, they're horrible, they are not serious about the spiritual life. I'm out as soon as I can. I'm becoming a real monk, a rigorous monk, a Carthusian." "Oh," she says, tell me more. And then she said, "Would you like to hear what God's doing in my life?" "Oh yeah." Well, this is after he's calmed down, "Oh yes." And she says, "Well, the Lord has spoken to me and the Lord has led me in this way, and I have permission to found new convents all over the place and 2 monasteries of Reformed Carmelite friars. How would you like to join my new adventure? He said, yes, as long as I don't have to wait long. He became John of the Cross. The virtue of listening before lecturing. The virtue of empathy, of building bonds with people, creates community. Not domination, not violence. So Teresa was somebody who, personally, I think, somebody who wanted to reform the church, that it may more clearly be the Church of Jesus, that it may more clearly be the Church of the Kingdom. And what it is called to be in its completion can begin now. One of the ways that Teresa felt stymied in the climate of the church of her day was she was a woman. And one of the things she did, and she wrote the book, The Way of Perfection, which I'm speaking about now, she wrote two versions of it. She wrote the first one quickly, the manuscript of which is now in the Escorial, the royal palace outside Madrid. The king wanted it, Philip II wanted it. Didn't want to read it. He wanted it as a relic. He thought she was a saint, and he's right. And then her friends, the Dominicans, helped her by saying, you're repeating yourself. This is too strong. This is too critical of the church. We have to cut this out, had to cut that out, cut this out. And the next bit I'm going to read to you was one of those sections that was cut out by the censors. So much so, in that original volume, which is now in the Royal Library in Escorial, they put lines through what Teresa wrote. Then they put vertical lines and then cross-hatched it. And then they put backwards and forwards. Then they turned the page over and on the back as well, so you couldn't put it against the light and read it. Only when X-rays were invented that people recovered the text. So this is Teresa being frank. So we've recovered this. And this is a lament addressed to Jesus. Since you, my Creator, are not ungrateful, I think you will not fail to do what they, women, beg of you. Nor did you, Lord, when you walked the world, despise women. But rather, you always with great compassion helped them. And you found as much love and more faith in them than you did in men. Among them was your most blessed mother. Is it not enough, Lord, that the world has intimidated us, so that we may not do anything worthwhile for you in public, or dare speak some truths that we lament over in secret, without your also failing to hear so just a petition? I do not believe, Lord, that this could be true of your goodness and justice, for you are a just judge, and not like those of the world, since the world's judges are sons of Adam, and all of them men. There is no virtue in women that they do not hold suspect. Yes, indeed, the day will come, my King, when everyone will be known for what he or she is. The virtues of women, the place of women, will be recognised. I do not speak for myself, because the world already knows my wickedness, and I have rejoiced that this wickedness is known publicly, but because I see that these are times in which it would be wrong to undervalue virtuous and strong souls, even though they are women. So she tells the nuns, don't pray for spiritual experiences that are pleasant and consoling for yourself. Pray for the church. Pray for the church that it may accept the gifts of women. When we ask you for the honour of your Son, why wouldn't you hear us, Eternal Father, for the sake of him who lost 1,000 honours and 1,000 lives for you? Not for us, Lord, for we don't deserve it, but for the blood of your Son and his merits. Teresa was very aware, as I think we can pick up clearly from chapter 3 of the book, The Way of Perfection, where she's reminding the nuns of why this foundation was made. The issues affecting the church, the issues affecting the ability to women to pray. One of the reasons for enclosure for Carmelite nuns in Teresa's idea was to create a free space for women where they could pray without interference from pesky authorities and superiors, male superiors. We had a seminar on St Teresa, a Carmelite seminar, about 10 years ago in Barraville, where I live outside Sydney. And we had a wonderful American professor, Alison Weber, who's not a Catholic, but who loves St Teresa dearly. And Alison was making this point of why the enclosure was there. And she was making a number of points that Carmelites, like the sort of Carmelites I belong to, don't really pick up on. That Teresa in some ways makes the enclosure more permeable because she wants to encourage spiritual conversations between the sisters and those outside. But she was also talking about stopping the interference from well-meaning clerics who would make visitations, hear confessions and so on, and they would think that they had not done their job properly unless they added an extra penance for the life of the sisters. Because they had this mentality of the time, that what was important in religious life was a life of miraculous penances where people didn't eat except to receive the Eucharist, didn't sleep, and didn't wash. 3 marks of holiness. You don't eat, you fast all the time, you keep vigils in prayer all night instead of going to bed, and you don't wash, because Muslims and people like that do that. Teresa, in her letters to her friends, is often saying, are you sure you are looking after your body well enough? Are you eating well enough? Are you getting enough sleep? And hygiene was very important for her. Why? You have a body, it carries your spirit. Through your body and your spirit, you have been given a mission in the world. If you maltreat your body, you cannot fulfill the mission the Lord has given you. So she rejects that idea of ostentatious austerity, fasting, vigils, and so on, and replaces it with a great emphasis on virtues. You know, yesterday we heard of the 3 most important virtues in the way of perfection that Teresa talks about, which are detachment from all things equals spiritual freedom, not clinging to this or that observance or this need or that need, but to trust God, to hope and to be free, to have a humble faith, a humble way of walking in the truth of who you are, of being a servant, not a lord, not somebody who dominates, but somebody who has an abiding love of Jesus, who heals us and empowers us to love those who are near to us. Detachment, love of those near to us, and humility. And what these bring about is a style of life that is very different from what the people of Teresa's day thought a really terrific way of religious life would be, that which was heroic in its penance. Unfortunately, Teresa's ideas didn't always last. Certainly among the friars there was a great movement against the humanism of Teresa. She valued learning. She wanted priests who were, 1, learned, 2, holy. And she said, if you can't get a priest who is learned and holy, try for one who's learned. At least they know the scriptures. But if they're just pious and they have no learning, not good. Not good at all. They can lead you anywhere. Piety needs the control of learning. Teresa, 5 years after making the foundation of San Jose, has this extraordinary Franciscan missionary from Mexico come and tells her all about the millions of people who have never heard the gospel, who are outside the church. This awakens in her a missionary desire. Her conversion was for herself, then the young women, then for the church in its broken body through the Reformation, and now to all those outside the church. These are the people that she's concerned about. Her heart goes out to all the world. Ignatius has rules for thinking with the church. Teresa has rules for feeling with humanity. All of humanity, including the church. So, Teresa begins to make foundations after this. Quite extraordinary, to be honest. I can't get over the fact that this meeting with Alonso Maldonado, awakes her to the reality of people in America. Because all her brothers were there. All of them. And living lives that gave her great anxiety. How can they be saved? They're living with women, they're having children out of wedlock, they're doing all sorts of bad things, they're getting involved in battles. Some of them are getting illnesses and dying, some of them are being wounded in battle and dying. She's very anxious about this, so she would be aware of what's happening in America. But this man, the penny drops, and then the sense of mission, and then this idea that mendicant orders like ours, the women don't have a superior. Each house is autonomous, Carmelite nuns. And the superiors of the men are the superiors of the men and the women. So Teresa thinks, I've got to get men who are on my wavelength. A renewed way of life who will support the women, live the same style of life, understand them from within and support them. So she gets John of the Cross and another friar. 1568 she makes foundations of the friars. What I think Teresa says to us today is many things. I've deliberately spoken about the 16th century, and I've let you draw any conclusions that you might like to draw yourself about issues facing the Catholic Church and other Christian churches today. It's not that difficult. The issues affecting people today. Teresa says to us, as Jesus says to his disciples in John's Gospel, chapter 15, verse 9, abide in me, abide in my love. Abide with Christ, who washes the feet of the poor and the disabled, of those who are excluded and those who have no place at the table. She embodies for me, I think, a similar message to that which a present-day witness speaks of. At the end of the Second Vatican Council, 50 years ago this December, the Council agreed on a series of messages to the world. Teresa's emphasis on poverty, on those who are excluded, is echoed by what the Council said. All of you who feel heavily the weight of the cross, you who are poor and abandoned, you who weep, you who are persecuted for justice, you who are ignored, you, the unknown victims of suffering, take courage. You are the preferred children of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of hope, happiness and life. You are these sisters and brothers of the suffering Christ, and with him, if you wish, you are saving this world. This is the Christian science of suffering, the only one which gives peace. Know that you are not alone, separated, abandoned, or useless. You have been called by Christ and are his living and transparent image to the poor, the sick, and the suffering. A great witness after the council, a layman in the church, I think, is Jean Vanier, the Canadian philosopher and the founder of the L'Arche communities and Faith and Light movement. He had written a book, which I just quoted, that message of the council to the world, which I think is a wonderful book. It's called The Signs of the Times, 7 Paths of Hope for a Troubled World. And I think that what he is calling us to today is something very consonant with the spirit of St Teresa. We are called to love and to service, not to be defensive, to move from the humiliations that the church is suffering at this time to a genuine humility. From conformity to observances to an awareness of personal conscience. From having our identity through exclusions to finding our identity in encountering the other. From reliance on power and domination to a reawakening to what authority really is. From separation and isolation to community. From secrets to mystery. And the mystery is Christ hidden within us and within the life of the poor. Christ who is at the heart of the church and through whose spirit we are united one to another and are given our mission. A church that surely today can receive the gifts of all its members. When will the church receive the fullness of the Holy Spirit? When it receives the charisms of all its members. It's not over yet, folks. And that surely does mean the charisms of women and of youth. We have models in our world today of what a church that welcomes might be like. On the 12th of May this month, we will celebrate the 100th birthday of Brother Roger Schutz, the founder of Taizé. A place of welcome and hospitality for young people, a sign and a light in the world. On the 8th of December this year, the 50th anniversary of the closing of the Second Vatican Council, is also the 50th birthday of the community of Bosè in Italy, founded on the day the council closed to continue the spirit of the council, founded by Enzo Bianchi, an ecumenical community of men and women living a life of welcome reconciliation through their hospitality and their art. I've spoken of Jean Vanier of L'Arche and of Faith and Light, of San Egidio, I didn't speak, but another great community, the Catholic Worker Movement founded by Dorothy Day and Peter Moran in the United States. And today the whole church rejoices in the witness of the humility and simplicity, the insight and the power of the Spirit that the Bishop of Rome, Francis, has given us, and of the hope that he brings, that we may have a church of mercy that is the bright face of the merciful God for the people of today and tomorrow. We can look back to witnesses like Teresa, and we can look at the issues of our world today with the help of the saints of today and see much of that same message. Thank you all for your attention.